All right, maybe I will begin with the intro slides. So I am calling this meeting of the Boston Region Metropolitan Planning Organization TIP Process Engagement and Readiness Committee to order. You are invited to participate in our transportation planning process, regardless of your race, color, national origin, including limited English proficiency, religion, creed, gender, ancestry, ethnicity, disability, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, veteran status, or background. All right, and we have some guidelines for virtual meetings. So everyone will join the meeting with muted microphones. We ask that you rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation. After roll call, board members may mute and unmute themselves. Always remain muted unless actively speaking. To participate in the discussion, please select the raised hand feature. You can find this by clicking on participants at the bottom of the screen, and a window will pop up with the raise hand button at the bottom or in the reactions button in the toolbar. And then I will, as chair, will call on you to participate. If you're on a phone, you use *9. And if you have any technical difficulties, please contact is it Erin McGuire, or I think maybe Srileka is taking Erin's place for this meeting.
I apologize. It is Srileka.
Okay, great. So Srileka Murthy at smurthy@ctps.org. And then accessibility statement. This meeting is being recorded. If you don't wish to appear, you can turn off your video. It is also accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised Section 508 standards. Oh, and thank you for putting, Shrika put her email address in the chat. And if you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully, please contact Srileka. Srileka put their contact information in the chat, and their email is smurthy@ctps.org. Great. So now I'll take a roll call of the committee members present. I'm Chair, I'm Jen Rowe from the City of Boston. MassDOT seat 1.
Yep, I believe that's me, Derek Cravat here, MassDOT Office of Transportation Planning.
Great. Thank you, Derek. MassDOT seat 2. Maybe John Bouchard might be on his way. Let's return back. We'll go to MAPC.
Good afternoon, Eric Barrasso with MAPC.
Eric, Regional Transportation Advisory Council.
Leonard Diggins Advisory Council here. Sorry for the background sounds.
Nice, thanks, Len. Town of Brookline.
Good afternoon, Erin Chute, representing Chair Bernard Green for the Town of Brookline.
Thanks, Erin. Town of Arlington.
Good afternoon. This is John Alessi representing Select Board Chair Eric Helmuth in the Town of Arlington. I just want to give a warning. I have to leave this meeting at 2:30, so apologies in advance for the early departure. Thank you.
Thank you. Intercore Committee, City of Somerville. Not seeing Brad or Tom. I can circle back afterwards. Metro West Regional Collaborative.
Dennis Giambetti, Metro West.
Great, thanks, Dennis. And then Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination.
Good afternoon, Kristen Guichard, representing Jim Snyder Grant, Select Board Chair for the Town of Acton.
Great, thank you. And then has John Bouchard or Brad Ralston joined? If not, they maybe later on.
I do not believe they have joined yet.
Okay. Well, let's continue on. We do have a full agenda today, so we're going to skip over verbal introductions of staff and members of the public, but feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. And if you have a question or comment at any point in the meeting, you can raise your hand. And once I recognize you, you can unmute and state your name and affiliation just so everyone knows who's speaking. The only vote that we have before us today is actually just to approve the meeting minutes, but we do have a number of other items. We'll hear from Betsy about an overview of how staff plans to help us understand if the projects that we choose to fund in the TIP have the potential to mitigate disparate impacts that staff has previously identified in the long-range transportation plan. Following that, Ethan will summarize what we learned about project readiness and share one additional update there. We've then built in a designated period of time to hear from municipal staff who were specifically invited to speak about changes to project cost and readiness. And then after that, we'll hear a bit from the MBTA about projects they're bringing forward as potential fill-ins for the earlier years of the TIP that have at the moment some surplus funding. And then finally, Ethan's going to walk us through and then guide a discussion around key issues before the MPO board this TIP cycle, namely how to address the funding deficit in federal fiscal year 27, including whether to deprogram projects at least temporarily, and then how to decide among the 15 TIP design pilot applications that we have before us. So before we begin, we do have a rather formal opportunity for public comment. That said, if your comment relates to one of the aforementioned items and you're able to stay later on in the meeting, I'd encourage you to make your comment at that later point. But all that said, do any members of the public wish to speak now? All right, I see Bill, City of Cambridge.
Yeah, hi Jen. Thanks a lot. I do have to leave for a meeting at 2 p.m. So I don't know. I'm willing to wait to give an update on our TIP design funding application. But I just wanted to note that I need to leave before 2, so I'm not sure when I should speak.
Ethan, I think perhaps maybe to speak now just in case. Does that make sense? Yeah, seeing Ethan nod, so maybe just in case I can go ahead and comment now.
All right, thanks so much. So the city of Cambridge is very excited to say that we yesterday received the $2.4 million grant from the Reconnecting Communities program, the federal program. So that's super exciting for us. It does mean in the short term that we won't be looking for that amount of money from the TIP for design funding. But we still have not yet bid out the design for the entire bicycle pedestrian bridge and path project, the Fitchburg crossing. So our estimate of right now, we're hoping that we have enough design funds, but we won't actually know that until we get bids on that design package. And we're in the process of working with our purchasing department right now to try to get that out as soon as possible, knowing that we have the grant in hand. So I just wanted to give people an update on that, and I hope that we can get that design done very quickly and come back to the MPO looking for construction funds. Thanks.
Congratulations. That's great news. Ethan, do you have any follow-up questions on that item, or?
I believe we've been in touch with Bill and other folks with the City of Cambridge on this project a few times now, and we'll provide updates to members of this committee and the board as more information comes out.
Fantastic. Thank you. Kara.
Hear me okay? Hi, everyone. So I'm Kara Stadium with the City of Cambridge. I have to confess, I'm not 100% sure. I just wanted to make a brief comment about our Blue Bikes proposal. Is it okay if I do that at this time as well? It's that news that Bill shared is obviously the thing that sort of overshadows everything. But I just wanted to really say how much we appreciate the fact that the MPO has recognized the importance of blue bikes and the state of good repair by providing dedicated funding for the system for that, specifically for that. It is just so important, as you know, to keep our public transit systems in a state of good repair. So I really thank you all for helping to do that. And we want to, make sure that the system is reliable. For our proposal this year, the specific stations that we were looking to replace are some of the busiest in the entire system. They're near transit stations. They're in census tracts with the populations that we particularly want to support. And just go on the record to say that we're really we feel really proud of our blue bike system as a truly affordable and reliable form of transportation. And there's millions of trips that are now being taken every year throughout the system. And also in Cambridge, hundreds of thousands of trips. We've been building out our network, adding stations to get to our goal of having a station within like a 5-minute or less walk of everyone who lives or works in this city. It's also important to make sure that those stations are functional and people can really rely on them. And so that's why we are very excited and happy about this opportunity to replace our systems through this state of good repair and ensure that, that people who live and work and visit our cities are able to do so and really have a reliable system. So I just want to say we're really happy about this. Hope that we can get the full funding for all of the communities that ask for it. And thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Cara. Rich.
Unmute. There I go. All right. Thank you. Just here this morning, I just want to, at this point in the agenda, just want to introduce myself. I'm here representing today the town of Brookline, city of Everett, city of Lynn, city of Woburn, and the town of Wakefield. Looking forward to item 5 on the agenda when we'll be talking about program projects. I have had some correspondence with Ethan. Eric, I recall the beginning of this committee, when this committee was first being talked about. So I think it's great that that there's a forum to talk about project readiness and those sorts of things. I know Mayor Michael Concannon is on the call this morning as well from Woburn. I know he's going to want to talk a little bit about the Woburn Center project, as well as Commissioner Shute from Brookline, who's actually a member of this committee. So I have plenty of information, can hopefully answer some of the questions relative to project readiness on projects in those communities that I mentioned. So appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. And I do see that John Bouchard entered the room, so we do have our second MassDOT rep present. So any additional public comment before we move to the one vote of the afternoon, the meeting minutes? All right. Seeing none, I will turn it over to Ethan, or actually maybe I just bring this up to vote. Ethan was prepared a summary of the meeting minutes from December 14th. Anything you wanted to add there, Ethan?
I would just note that these meeting minutes are available for review on the calendar for this meeting, and we're also posted as well. If there are any questions that folks have on the minutes, feel free to comment so we can make adjustments.
Great, thank you. Eric.
Eric Barrasso, I'll make a motion to approve the December 14th meeting minutes.
Thank you, Eric. Aaron.
I second that motion.
Fantastic. Any kind of points of question or conversation around the meeting minutes? All right. Seeing none, let's take the roll. And I believe Srileka is going to lead us in that. That's okay. If not, happy to do so.
I can take over on the roll for that.
Oh, okay.
Apologies. City of Boston.
Genro, yes.
MassDOT seat 1, Derek Cravat.
Derek Cravat, yes.
MassDOT seat 2, Highway Division and Project Management.
Is that supposed to be Ethan?
That is you, John.
So my apologies for being late. I was running from another meeting. Yes.
Metropolitan Area Planning Council,
Eric Barassa, MAPC, yes.
Regional Transportation Advisory Council,
Diggins, yes.
Town of Brookline,
Aaron Shute, yes.
Town of Arlington,
John Alessi, yes.
Intercore Committee, City of Somerville. I do not see Tom Bent or Brad Rawson still. So moving on, Metro West Regional Collaborative, City of Framingham.
Dennis Giambetti, yes.
And lastly, Minuteman Advisory Group on Interlocal Coordination, Town of Acton.
Kristen Gishard, yes.
Right, and with that, that's the roll. I believe that passes.
I believe that does pass. Thank you. We'll move on to the next agenda item, where we have Betsy Harvey here to speak to us about TIP disparate impact and disproportionate burden overview. So take it away, Betsy.
Great, thanks, Jen, and good afternoon, everyone. Next slide, please. My name is Betsy Harvey. I run the Transportation Equity Program. Go back one. Thank you. I run the Transportation Equity Program for the Boston MPO, and I'm going to talk a bit today about our work over the past few months to develop a methodology for evaluating the effectiveness of the projects programmed in the TIP at addressing disparate impacts and disproportionate burdens that were identified in our 2023 Long-Range Plan Destination 2050, and how we can use the projects that we program in the TIP to mitigate those impacts. All of this information that I'm going to be talking about, including the results, are found in a handout posted on the MPO calendar, so feel free to follow along as I go. Next slide. So to provide some background on what a disparate impact and disproportionate burden analysis is, it's also called a DIDB analysis, which I'll be using as shorthand. It analyzes whether MPO-funded projects as a group would likely disproportionately affect minority or low-income populations. In Destination 2050, we identified 3 potential disparate impacts, which are those adverse impacts on the minority population, as well as 3 potential disproportionate burdens, which are those adverse impacts on the low-income population. Mitigation of these impacts are required by federal regulations, and the most logical place for doing so is by funding projects in the TIP that would make things better in the areas for which we identify disparate impacts and disproportionate burdens. Over the past few months, we've been developing a process that we could replicate in any year that we need to mitigate disparate impacts and disproportionate burdens. I'm going to, in a moment, show you the results of a test run with projects that could potentially be on the fiscal year 2025 to 29 TIP as of December 31st, 2023. So note, of course, it's not the projects that have been programmed, selected for programming. Those haven't been selected yet. It is a group of projects that is representative of potential projects that could be on the TIP this year. We wanted to see if the process made sense before we do analyze the final TIP program of projects later this month, and to give MPO members a preview of what they could expect to see in a mitigation analysis. Next slide. So let's start first with what the metrics are that we found disparate impacts and disproportionate burdens for. In Destination 2050, we analyzed a total of 11 metrics for their impacts on minority and low-income populations, and found 3 instances of disparate impacts and 3 instances of disproportionate burdens, which are listed on the screen, and I'll just read them off real quick. The disparate impacts on minority populations we found were in access to healthcare within a 25-minute transit trip, average travel time by driving, and average travel time by transit. The disproportionate burdens on the low-income population were access to jobs within a 45-minute transit trip, access to healthcare within a 25-minute transit trip, and access to parks and open space within a 45-minute drive. So know that these metrics look at impacts across the region. So we're looking at average travel time, for example, across the entire region for all minority population in the region. So it doesn't look at specific projects or specific areas of the region. It's a region-wide analysis. Next slide. So to analyze TIP projects to see whether we could mitigate these disparate impacts, we use Conveil, which is a destination access tool, which we can also use to calculate average travel times by different travel modes. The projects that we included in our mitigation analysis were those funded in the 2024 to 28 TIP, so last year's TIP, that also have funding years in the 2025 to 29 TIP, or this upcoming TIP. as well as new projects that were submitted for funding consideration for this year's TIP. Our cutoff date was December 31st of 2023. So project scopes that changed or new projects that were submitted after that date were not included in the analysis. This is really just a practical matter to give us enough time to run conveil and produce the results for today. So of those two groups of projects, there were some of those projects that we couldn't end up analyzing for several reasons, which I'll go through. We did not include design pilot projects. Since they have not been designed yet, we didn't have enough project information to put them in conveil. But should they become construction projects, that's when we could analyze them in conveil. We also excluded projects that don't change travel speed, add new links to the transportation network, such as a new off-street path, or change road rate geometry, like the removal of a travel lane. Changes that would affect how quickly people can reach destination. Conveil is responsive to changes to the transportation network that would affect the speed at which people can reach destinations. And so only those projects that have at least one of those elements are included in the analysis. So for example, a bike rack project where we're just installing bike racks would not affect destination access. And so that sorts of projects were not included in our analysis. At this time, we're also not able to include bike share or microtransit projects because of their complexity. But we are working closely with folks over at Conveil on adding these projects to Conveil. So it just wasn't done in time for this work, but we do anticipate including those projects in future years in mitigation analyses. Next slide. So I want to talk now about the results. I just mentioned again that these charts are in the handout on the MPO calendar, so do feel free to look at those as well if you'd like. So the results on the screen are for the minority population, 3 metrics for which we identified disparate impacts in our long-range plan. And the goal of the analysis was to show the change in access to see if destinations or travel time for each population group we could expect to see if the projects in the TIP were constructed. The chart showed the amount that needs to be mitigated. So that's the black dot in the center of the chart. This is the difference in impacts between the minority and non-minority population. For example, the number of jobs. In some cases, this amount is very small. However, federal regulations do state that any disparity must be mitigated no matter the size. In addition, one year, the amount may be quite small, but added up over many years, this can lead to major disparities for populations who have for decades disproportionately borne the negative impacts and denied the benefits of our transportation system. The charts also show whether the projects would benefit the minority or low-income populations to the extent that these differences are mitigated. That purple line means that the impact would be mitigated, and its length past the black dots indicates by how much. Conversely, the orange line means that the impact would not be mitigated. If it does not reach that black dot, it means the impact would be improved, but not fully mitigated. So from the minority population, we can see that one of the 3 disparate impacts would be mitigated, which was the access to healthcare within the 25-minute transit trip graph on the chart on the top of the screen. Whereas the other 2 metrics, travel time for transit and for drive trips, would not be. Note that the average travel time metrics are heading in the right direction. While they're not fully mitigated, they do show improvements for the minority population. And keep in mind, in this case, for travel time, the directionality is the reverse for destination access. We want to see a decrease in travel time, but an increase in access. So that's minority population results. So if we go to the next slide, we can look at the low-income population results. The low-income population, we can see that one of the disproportionate burdens would be mitigated as well. Access to jobs within a 45-minute transit trip. Again, that top chart on the screen. Access to healthcare within a 45-minute transit trip would not be mitigated, but it is headed in the right direction, so it's improving access. However, access to parks and open space within a 45-minute drive is going in the wrong direction, as it shows that access is decreasing more for the low-income population than for the non-low-income population. Next slide. So those are results for our test run of this mitigation analysis. So I want to talk a little bit now about some of the next steps this year and kind of going into kind of the next tip cycle as well. When the MPO selects a final programming scenario for the tip later this month, we will run a final DIDB mitigation analysis to determine the extent to which the disparate impacts and disproportionate burdens that I discussed today would be mitigated in the 2025 tip. The MPO doesn't need to accomplish full mitigation in this year's tip. For one, this year's work was focused on developing Conveyo's utility for this mitigation analysis, and further work will be done over the next year to finalize our methodology and develop an overall process for establishing when and how mitigation is accomplished. We anticipate updating the MPO's DIDB policy with this information. We'll certainly be discussing those changes with the MPO board later on this year. In addition, we are currently conducting a study called Applying Conveyo to Tip Project Scoring, which will allow us to develop destination access evaluation criteria for upcoming tips. Once criteria are established, the MPO will be able to evaluate projects individually for their impact on destination and access, and therefore have a much better idea of which projects could contribute to mitigating remaining disparate impacts and disproportionate burdens in future tips. So we would then run the DIDB mitigation analysis next year to see how well the projects would mitigate overall as a group. And so there'll be a not only looking at impacts of projects as a whole, as we're doing this year, but also be able to look at impacts of projects on destination access individually when we take projects in to evaluate them for funding. So overall, we found this to be a pretty successful test run. We feel confident that we can use Conveyo as a way to mitigate and analyze the mitigation ability of TIP projects. We'd love to hear your feedback, questions that you have about how this analysis worked, or anything else that you might be wondering about mitigation analysis or disparate impacts. So that's all for me, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Betsy. It's really amazing being able to see like results even midway through the tip process. So thank you for you and everyone on staff who's worked on this. I see some hands up already. I think I saw Eric's first.
Yeah, thanks, Betsy. Betsy, what is the measure again? Maybe you could go back to the slide. Is that minutes?
For which metric?
That's jobs. Go back. I think it's so the first one is, what is the measure there? Is that travel time, or is that the number of health care facilities?
That's the number of healthcare facilities. So each metric does have a different unit. The second two average travel time metrics, that's minutes.
So what is a 0.004 healthcare facility? Like, well,
that is a really good question. It's basically a mathematical concept of this is how many more when we compare how many facilities people have access to. It's less than one healthcare facility. The difference isn't conceptually very large, which is the case for many of these. But it still is technically, mathematically speaking, a difference.
So we're talking about less than one.
Yeah. Also, the fact that there are very few healthcare facilities in the region kind of impacts kind of how big of a difference. You'll notice, like for jobs, there are many more jobs in the region, and so we do have like a whole number of jobs that that people, in terms of the difference between an access.
And for the other two, again, what's like 0.00329 minutes? Like, is that?
That's less than a minute. So if it's
okay,
whatever kind of mathematically that comes out to, it's not a lot of time. So one of the reasons why you get some of these wonky numbers is because we are looking at this in a regional scale, right? And so when you average things out, the differences end up, you take out kind of the very high differences, the very low differences on either end, and you end up with kind of this average that means that the difference between
I-
the difference between two population groups is very small.
Okay. I mean, I think it's important. I think it's important though, because if we're talking about like the difference is just like a second or like in this case, like less than is that less than a second?
Less
Like,
than a minute. Well, I'm not sure. I don't know exactly.
a
the
couple
numbers, I guess,
seconds,
but-
like to me, that seems like and is that like per person?
Yeah, we when we were developing the disparate impact policy, we really struggled with this a lot, was kind of this, how big of an impact is like an impact that is appropriate for us to address, to mitigate. And as we were working through it, one of the things a couple of things that we realized, one is that, like I said, this is an average. And so there are people who actually are experiencing a very, very disparate travel times on kind of, if you looked at all 3 million people in the region and looked at you would find people who have very, very, very long travel times, and you would find people with very, very short travel times.
Yeah.
And so we didn't necessarily feel comfortable saying like, just because it's a small difference on average, it's still, for some people, very, very long travel times that they're dealing with. And to be able to, and then the second point is that I think I mentioned in the presentation was that year might be very small differences, but when you add it up over time, especially when we're dealing with populations who have been burdened by adverse impacts of the transportation system much more than others, then we don't want to be kind of perpetuating some of these negative impacts year after year when we know that for decades they've been really underserved and harmed by some of the transportation impacts.
I will say that like it's hard. This is the way that this is presented. It's a little hard to kind of get my mind around it. Like particularly if we're talking about something that's like the difference is like a less than a minute and could be measured in seconds. Like to me that doesn't feel like that much of a difference. I think if we were talking about on average people, having 10, 20 minute, travel time differences, to me that calls out like a much bigger issue. And it could just be that because we're doing this at such a high regional scale, that it kind of, everything kind of gets kind of washed out, and it's hard to see where certain geographies pop or something like that. But yeah, that's like just see these metrics like 0.00329 minute difference just seems like hard to understand what that really means.
Thanks, Eric. I think I saw Len next.
I hear you, Eric, and I understand how you feel, and it's only because I was involved in helping to develop this DBI policy, that I understand or value these small changes, because as Betsy said, we couldn't justify any other threshold other than an absolute difference, and so if there is a difference, then we wanted to understand, not understand, but we wanted to try to mitigate it. And so I would think numbers as kind of intensities, Eric, and didn't think like if someone's on the margin, that like fraction of a second when you kind of, it's an average, meaning, so for someone, that fraction of a second or a minute, may multiply into, 10 minutes, meaning, so if they're on the margin, then that will make a difference. So we're looking, it is a regional assessment at this point. And Betsy said later on they'll try to do things more specific. So I understand where you're coming from, and it took a number of meetings, for all of us who were working on this to wrap our heads around it. It's kind of good to see it coming back now, Betsy, and I think those of us who want to use PWP committee who approved this study, Convale are particularly happy, to see, the use of it. So you say that's only for travel time. Can travel costs be be used by Convale, or is it strictly for travel? I'm sorry, travel costs. Can travel costs be incorporated into this, or is it only going to ever be able to do travel time?
So in terms of metrics, we can select we have flexibility to select whichever metrics the board and staff feel are important for us to measure, and that we have the tools to measure, so that, you know, the next LRTP, which we will be developing over the next 3 years or so, will be returning to metrics and updating those as we see fit and as the board sees fit. So that would be a discussion we could certainly have.
So Cavale can do cost. That's good to know. All right.
Well, I'll say that we have tested some. I'll say sort of, and we can maybe talk a little more offline. It's not directly a cost measurement tool, but there are certain ways that we could potentially get at certain travel time costs.
Okay, all right, and I'll be happy to talk with you offline about it. But one other question: can you help us with looking at assessing various scenarios? Because you say that you're going to, when we've chosen our project for the TIP, you'll then look to see to what extent those mitigate. But I think it'd be helpful if we could get some guidance. I mean, let's say Ethan throws at us 2 or more scenarios. Could you see it as being helpful in giving us guidance as to which scenario to choose?
I think short answer is yes, but I think the challenge is the time frame in which we develop the TIP is pretty short, and it's not, you know, it's certainly a fairly quick analysis to run, but it's not kind of an immediate thing where you just can do it on the fly. So it would partly depend on kind of the amount of how quickly we can get projects in and how much time we have to run Conveyal before we need to finish the TIP.
Wondering how long the run took. And one last question. And so as you said, you did a lot of you looked at a lot of projects, especially in comparison to the LRTP, in order to see to what extent it could be mitigated. But sometimes when you run a large number of different projects, you kind of suppress your average, and so I'm thinking, like, if maybe you chose a subset of projects or various subsets, you might see bigger differences. It might give you some insights as to which projects are having larger effects. So even though you presented us with all 19 or whatever you use, did you run smaller sets of projects just to get some insight?
No, we stuck to kind of what the federal regulations are, is looking at the entire program of projects. I think when we develop destination access criteria for the TIP, we'll be able to get more at kind of individual projects and what role they might play in advancing access and travel times.
All right. Thank you very much. This was great, Betsy. As always, good work. Thanks.
Excellent. I see a question from Aaron. I will note that there was a question in the chat about the method used to determine whether a measure is a disparate impact or a disproportionate burden. Because we have a lot else on the agenda, I just want to note quickly there that it's quite complicated. We could probably, I'm sure Betsy could speak to it for quite a long time. There was, as was referenced, a working group that kind of established these measures, and I think I will put in the chat a link to the memo that kind of goes into more detail on the methodology, and I will also, hopefully, if it's okay, volunteer Betsy to take additional kind of back and forth on that offline. With that, I'll turn it over to Erin for our last comment on this body fork.
Thank you to the chair, and thank you, Betsy, for your work on this. I will change my question to a comment so that we can move along. And I think this is also for us on the subcommittee and for the MPO to consider also going forward. I appreciate the metrics. I also appreciate using access to parks and open space, as that increasing research has shown positive, healthy outcomes for those that have access to open space. Just thinking, as we're looking at individual projects, and I'm looking at these metrics, in some cases, the park or open space is where it is, the right-of-way in the corridor is, but we're making multimodal improvements. And so the time may not change, but we now have protected bike lanes or other ways to get to these spaces. So how can we look at that? And also, some of the projects, our goals really are around accommodating more users and slowing traffic. And so I don't know that we want to just look at travel time. So just as we look at kind of specific projects, maybe looking at goals and how we may be better serving some of these communities. So just food for thought for the future.
Hey, thanks so much for that feedback.
Well, There we go. Thank you so much, Betsy, and everyone for conversation here. I know Betsy will be back later on in the cycle to share the final analysis as well. So there'll certainly be more opportunities for dialogue around this. But thank you for being here today. And now I believe we're going to move on to the next item of the agenda, and I'll turn it over to Ethan.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ethan Lapointe. I'm the Transportation Improvement Program Manager. So if we can go on to the next slide. The purpose of my presentation here today is to provide an overview of the strategies that we are looking to pursue as we try to develop the federal fiscal years 2025 to 29 TIP. There will be multiple parts of my presentation here today, along with some updates. But first off, as we did in the last meeting, I'd like to begin with a recap of what we discussed at our February 15th MPO meeting and the subsequent TIP committee meeting that afternoon. So if we could go on to the next slide. Part of the reason why we are having this discussion here today was the findings of TIP readiness days. At the readiness discussion that was had between MPO staff and MassDOT and conveyed at the last meeting, we identified that 16 projects in the MPO's regional target program of 28 projects overall were recommended for delay. These projects were predominantly in federal fiscal years 2025 and 2026, with about 66% of all projects in 25 being delayed and about 75% of projects in fiscal 26 being delayed. There were also a further 8 projects at risk of delay as well, where they may not have been shifted in this TIP cycle, but as we develop fiscal 26 and 30 this time next year, we might see something happen there if certain issues are not resolved. Moreover, 13 projects of those 28 also witnessed cost increases above 10%. Not included, or included in that number, if we go on the next slide, is one new project, which was not ready to be conveyed at the TIP readiness days discussion in February. This was the Wilmington reconstruction on Route 38 project, which is a MassDOT proponent project that was programmed in the federal fiscal years 2021 to 25 TIP in fiscal year 25. The project has seen a 60% cost increase above its current budget of $23.73 million to a new revised budget of almost $38 million. The project recently received a 100% design threshold, but had last had 75% design done in 2021. Its 25% design was done in 2018, and it received PRC approval in 2014. So the project has had a long development life cycle. To that end, the cost of this project was last revised at the end of January, though there are still some discussions being had as to whether or not the $38 million is too high or if there's a possibility to lower it. Namely, the current cost estimate for the actual work and items attributable to unit cost increases resulting from inflation mostly account for less than half of the actual cost increase. What is really driving this the most is about $5.1 million in duct bank work for Verizon utilities under the project area, as this project is quite geographically large. Those who may be familiar with the area would know this runs functionally from Wilmington's commuter rail station down to the Woburn City line. And there's also an additional $2 million required for contaminated soil disposal. That is $2 million on top of $1.6 million for a total soil disposal cost of $3.6 million on the project. Again, there may be an opportunity to lower this cost somewhat as some of these items are still being worked out. There's about a good $8 million of additional anticipated costs factored in here above the baseline scope of work and other unit elements of the project itself. So with that, we also wanted to flag some projects that, if we go on the next slide, committee members had requested that project proponents attend this meeting so that they may answer questions on any changes to project scope, cost, or project readiness. We're hoping here, before we get into the full discussion at the end of this presentation, if we can go on to the next slide, to provide an opportunity to several towns that are here today to speak to their projects. These include the communities of Hingham for the Route 3A project, Everett for the Beecham Street project, Ashland for their Cherry Street rail grade crossing project. On the next slide, we also have Lynn for the rehabilitation of Essex Street, Belmont for their community path phase 1, Salem for the Boston Street improvements project, and the last 3 on the next slide being Weston for the reconstruction on Route 30, Woburn for their intersection improvements at Woburn Common and Route 38 Main Street, and Ipswich for the resurfacing and related work on Central and South Main Streets projects. So with that, if we go on to the next slide, if any of those municipalities or any stakeholders involved in those projects are present here today to speak, I would invite the opportunity for them to do so now.
Not sure what the format is, but J.R. Fry here for the town of Hingham. With me is Tom Laughlin of GM2, who is our design engineer. So thank you for the opportunity to discuss the cost increases on our project. The project itself, we have been working hard to manage the cost increases. In point of that, for example, we've increased the lane reduction that we had originally designed and provided and justified it based on the traffic load through the corridor. So in those areas, we were reducing lanes, but a lot of the challenges that the project is seeing relate to the fact that it's a coastal road that is jurisdictionally within wetlands for a significant portion of it, or near wetlands, as well as the ocean for a significant portion of it. And many of the elements that we added to the project were mitigation to prevent impacts to the abutting jurisdictional zones. The other challenge that we've faced throughout this is that this is also a heavily utilized subgrade utility corridor. And in order to minimize costs on this, we actually pulled out a lot of drainage work that was originally proposed because we recognized that it just wouldn't be possible to accomplish those drainage improvements while avoiding additional impacts to other subgrade utilities such as communications and natural gas. Tom, would you like to discuss further?
Sure, JR. Thank you. So let me kind of set the stage a little bit. The last price that was submitted for this project was back in 2019. It was prior to public hearing. We had a public hearing in 2022, February 2022. Just after that, I believe this was the first job that MassDOT performed a subsurface utility exploration survey. And from that, there were significant findings of utilities that, as JR said, required us to redesign the entire drainage system to avoid these utilities and not relocate them as best we could. There are significant relocations along this job, but that was a task that we had. Had we had that information prior to the 25, obviously we would have been able to include those numbers. The factors that are involved in this, there's some pretty significant items, as JR said, that were added to this job in order to mitigate or avoid. We have about $250,000 of hazmat items. There is a couple of pre-existing uses, gas stations, fueling stations along the road. We have $3.1 million of either new or reconstructed existing stone walls to avoid wetlands, to avoid right-of-way, and to stay out of the ocean, as JR had mentioned. We have minor increases in traffic for additional ped crossings, 250,000 or so. Landscaping items are about 1.4 million. And then wetland mitigation for a wetland replacement area, because we do have some impacts to wetlands of about $200,000. That totals about 5.1 million. Tacked on to the 16 that we began with in 2019. And the rest of it is a balance between inflation and cost savings, as JR has said, in avoiding some of these things. So inflation by itself, using MassDOT had issued a number to the SIM community where they were looking at cost of work adjustments in the range of 5% per year for a job back in 2019. That's a compounding factor of about 1.6. If you add that just to the 16 million, that takes us to about 25,600,000. And the last thing I would say is the number that you have of 33.7 has actually been adjusted on MassDOT's project info down to estimated total contract costs of 24.5 and a federal participating number of 27.6. So I'm not sure when that went to 33, and I'm not exactly sure when it went down to 27. I did notice both of them, but I'm not. The 27 is our number. That's what we submitted. So it must have been elevated to 33 of anticipated increases, maybe. I'm not sure.
Thank you so much, JR and Tom. That's really helpful. And we'll have to circle back with the different numbers there, unless Ethan has anything to jump in now. I will also say, and I neglected to mention earlier, that we also have received a number of comment letters from folks. So that's also another way to share information with us in addition to at these meetings.
If I could also mention, so in terms of just readiness alone, are we ready to move ahead? Take money out of it, right? Of course, we can't do that. But we are on schedule. We are expecting comments back from MassDOT in 45 days, maybe sooner. The town is doing everything they can to explain this to all of the property owners. The different people will need to contribute and continue to support this project. And we are working hand in hand with the utility companies on a number of issues, and they've been extremely cooperative in helping us avoid and mitigate their costs and everything else like that. So we are fully engaged in this job, and GM2 and the town are going to do everything we can to bring this forward and meet the dates that we have put forward. We know it, it may get moved, but we will be ready and then available to you as either an early job or early in the next fiscal year.
And while it isn't something that would be on the TIP planning radar because it was not included in our job, we notified National Grid of the impacts to some of their facilities within our right, or within the state's right of way. And upon doing that, they actually moved some of the necessary work into their own capital plan, and they're going to be executing a relocation of a regulating station that's currently in the 3A rotary outside of our anticipated work area, and that work is scheduled to take place next month.
Thank you so much. I guess I'll ask anything else from Hingham, and otherwise I saw Jay's hand over in Everett.
I would just say thanks for the opportunity to be responsive to the MPO's concerns.
Of course. All right, over to Jay. think you might still be muted, Jay.
Jen. Good afternoon, everybody. Jay Monty, Director of Transportation, City of Everett. I'm here today with Rich Benevento, who can explain sort of the details and ins and outs of the Beecham Street project. 8% increase, not huge, not unexpected for a project that is approaching 25% design. But I'll let Rich jump in here and give some details.
All right, thanks, Jay. I'm off of mute, I believe. Yes. Okay, good. Okay, so again, project approved back by PRC back in 2019. Obviously, the project, any of these projects, due to COVID and that kind of thing, kind of slowed things down a little bit. But we're happy to report that as of Monday, the 25% will be submitted. So that will be going in. Based on review durations and revised right-of-way and so forth, we're anticipating the public hearing sometime around July for the design public hearing. And we're anticipating a PS&E submission of July of 25. So that would get us to first quarter of 26 or the last quarter of 25. I know DOT doesn't necessarily like to bulk up everything at the last quarter of the year. But the project's moving forward. We have about 34 temporary easements. We're working with the abutters, maybe 10 permanent easements for utility, road, and sidewalks, things like that. One of the big issues here on Beecham Street is that there is a development project that's being anticipated. And so the city is moving in earnest to get the Beecham Street project ready to go so that it dovetails with this development project. We'd hate to have this project either lagging or be not in collaboration with the development project that's going on. And Jay can probably give us a little bit more insight on that development project. But relative to the project, I mean, things are moving fairly quickly on this. I'm not going to talk about the regional significance of the roadway. These projects wouldn't be in front of the MPO if they weren't important. So I don't think there's any point in talking about how regionally significant it is and the truck traffic and all that, but rather the project's moving forward in earnest. And again, as Jay mentioned, slight 8% increase from the original 10,500,000. And we don't anticipate any additional costs other than the longer the project sits, as we all know, the higher the price is. And, you know, the key of getting these projects out the door is so important. And I think before this committee was formed, we had those discussions at the MPO meeting. I remember providing some input on that as well. So the sooner we can get this out the door, the better, so that we can keep that price down. The other thing too is just, I know this is an important aspect of what the MPO has to deal with, and that is scope creep. The project limits are the same. They haven't increased. As a matter of fact, they may have decreased slightly, and hopefully we'll find some economy and savings on that aspect of it. But DOT will be looking for plans next week. They'll be coming in. So, Jay, is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, thanks, Rich. And yeah, just to talk a little bit more about the development along the corridor. This actually now bisects the former ExxonMobil oil tank farm that it was purchased by a developer about a year ago. So it's 100 acres that will be converted into high density mixed use over the coming decade. So, you know, the vision for this project, you know, is evolving, even though I think the scope will remain the same, but we're working with the developer to sort of add to it and add you know, if there were to be scope increase, right, it would be to the private developer, not onto the project is scoped on the tip. But nonetheless, we do want to coordinate that at the same time. So huge opportunity there.
Just lastly, the project was originally programmed on the FY25 tip. Again, whether the project advertised in September of 25 or October 1st of 26. But I do notice on the sheet that was provided that it looks like it's being moved out to 27, which would, again, is going to have an effect on cost. I think moving it to 26, Jay, I don't want to speak for you, but I mean, if we advertise in October or we advertise in September, I don't think that really matters too much to the city. Would that be a fair statement, Jay?
Yeah,
I don't want to speak for you.
That's fair, Rich. Thanks.
Yeah, that's really helpful to understand. Thank you. Does any further, I guess, do any of the members have questions either for Everett or for Hingham? Oh, and Rich, I see your hand up again. Is there something you wanted to mention?
Well, there's a few others, and I would like to, if we're done with Everett, and not that I want to jump in front of anyone else, but Mayor Michael Concanon is on the line. I know he's extremely busy. So if we could go to Woburn perhaps. So I know he sat through the first part of today's meeting, and I'm sure he found it very informative, but I'm sure he has more pressing issues in the city of Woburn today. So.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Jen. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the board. I'm the new mayor here in Woburn, just started in January. And my message today is to reaffirm 100% our commitment to this safety improvement project, which does impact our region. We did have a change in administration the beginning of January. So admittedly, there may have been a bit of a lag towards the last quarter of last year, but please make no mistake, we are fully committed to this. We have sent to our city council the necessary appropriation to get us to the next phase of design. We're anticipating fast action by the council on that. We have tremendous support for the project, tremendous community support for the project. And I think it would have a significant impact, again, not just to downtown Woburn, but the surrounding communities. As many people know, whenever there's an issue up on 95, 128, the Woburn-Burlington area, traffic finds its way through. And that simply compounds the situation we deal with in downtown Woburn. And we believe that this project would go a long way towards smoothing those issues out. So again, my message to the group is simple. We are 100% committed to this. We're providing the necessary funding to get us to the next step. And we would appreciate any consideration to keeping us where we are and keeping us on track. And I know that Rich has some more particulars he'd like to share with the group as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Mayor. And again, you can see not a huge increase in cost. That's pretty much in line with Federal Highway. They provide that 4% increase per year. But just in terms of where the project is right now, a conceptual design was prepared in 2022. There's been several efforts, again, it being a downtown area. A parking study was completed this past June. There's been some transitioning, even at DOT with project managers, but we've been advancing other aspects of the project. We're anticipating a waiver from ICE, given its location and the aspects of the project. Public outreach has been continuing. However, under Mayor Concanon's administration, we are ready to get that going again as part of his administration. Public outreach is so important, as we all know. We're looking to have the over-the-shoulder review in June or July, presuming that we go through the ICE waiver process. So that's coming up very, very quickly. And we think June and July summer, that's only a few months away. And we're anticipating our 25% submission in November of this year. So that's all on the schedule with a design public hearing in March of next year, March of 25, just about a year from now, 75% submission in October of that year, and then PS&E mid-2026. So we recognize that FY26 may be a challenge, but FY27 is certainly no challenge in order to get this project out the door. So we're hoping that the MPO will consider that. Again, considering the cost, as I said, and I can't say it enough, the longer they sit, the more expensive they get. So the scope of the project remains the same. No scope creep on this. If anything, we will try and value engineer some of these things down as we go through it. But there's been a lot of community support for the project. Naturally, it's a downtown area. We're planning to meet with business owners and so forth, particularly relative to parking and providing healthy transportation initiatives throughout the downtown area. But we'll be meeting with them. Those meetings are currently being scheduled as we speak. So all good.
Great. Thank you so much, for, Mayor and Rich. Really appreciate both of you joining to provide that context, and glad to hear that you think 27 is very doable. Will say I'm not seeing any other hands at the moment, and I also want to make sure that we are able to move to the next item because we do have some folks from the T who are here to share about their potential fill-in projects, and we want to make sure they have some opportunity for us to ask questions as well. I do see a hand from David. Is there something you wanted to add there?
Hi, thank you, Jen. Dave Kucharski, City of Salem Traffic and Parking Director. Just want to reiterate comments that Mayor Pangal left in the chat. Apologies he couldn't stay. Just want to know we're working on providing some additional information to the Salem PBD project to give that to you, and we're working that with our consultants and the city engineering office. So just want to reiterate that. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, and thanks for joining. All right, I will pass it now back to Ethan.
Right. Thank you very much. So before we move on to the MBTA projects, I'd just like to preface something real quick, if we can jump 2 slides from now. So part of the reason why that the MPO board and also members of this committee have asked the MBTA to come and present projects here today is due to a trend that has emerged in the TIP over the past few TIP cycles. This being that there is surplus funding available in the first 2 years of the 5-year plan, and there are no shovel-ready projects that from municipalities that can be put in this plan. There is still, in the draft scenario that I'll be presenting, hopefully at the end of this meeting, funding available in federal fiscal years 25 and 26 after accounting for all assumed commitments necessary to complete existing MPO-supported MBTA projects, which the T will be discussing, $8.3 million of funding to new regional transit authority projects for the Cape Ann Transportation Authority and the Metro West Regional Transit Authorities. An estimated $10.8 million in design funding is an estimate we've been considering, but it's a working number, and $2.7 million to fund all community connections projects as well. So again, there is still funding available even after all of those new projects are considered, after all cost increases on highway projects are factored in, and even the cost increases on currently funded MBTA projects. So with all of that in mind, to preface this, I'd like to hand this over to Sandy Johnston over at the MBTA for his presentation. Should be on the next slide.
All right, thank you very much for that incredibly helpful context, Ethan. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Sandy Johnston. I'm the Deputy Director of Regional Transit Planning at the MBTA and one of the primary MBTA representatives on the MPO board. I want to thank the MPO chair and all of the other members who requested that the MBTA bring this list of projects for consideration today. And I would also like to thank MPO staff for holding our hands in close collaboration through this process and letting us know what we needed. Ethan, you're a real star. And finally, before jumping into it, I want to thank all my many colleagues across the MBTA and our partners at municipalities and other agencies who really worked their butts off in a real sprint to pull all of this information together over the last week. Next slide, please. All right. So Ethan gave you some context. I'm going to repeat a little bit of it here just to make sure everybody's got full background. In response to a request from the MPO at the March 7th meeting, we have pulled together a list of projects that are kind of next up priorities for the authority and that are not currently funded in the MBTA's capital investment program for the MPO's consideration. The list that we are presenting today begins with a request for the MPO to fully fund projects with previous MPO commitments. We'll share more details about that in just a moment. Several potential new projects were identified through the fiscal years 25 through 29 capital investment program development process, and we're presenting them today in 3 categories. First is bus priority improvements, and then a couple of no regrets early action commuter rail, regional rail modernization investments, little projects that will help us get to that end state envisioned by the Rail Vision study, and then some accessibility and station access improvements. These projects are candidates for MPO regional target funding because they're federally eligible, currently advancing through design, and they are located within this MPO's region. As you all know, the MBTA commuter rail network in particular extends beyond this MPO's region. We have also, beyond those categories, organized the projects into 2 different scenarios. that we think are good attempts at capturing MBTA and MPO priorities. Just to set a little bit more context, today is an opportunity for discussion. The presentation today demonstrates the MBTA's top priority, but the scenarios here presented are drafts, and we are open to questions and suggestions. We're happy to take questions about individual projects, and if any of us in the Zoom room, I'm joined here by several colleagues, although I think some had 2 o'clock meetings. If any of us here don't know the answers, we'll try our hardest to get back to you with information before next week's meeting. Next slide, please. All right. So first, we know the MPO is committed to seeing through projects that it has already invested in. Like everyone else, MBTA is experiencing significant cost inflations, both in materials and personnel costs, and there have also been some unexpected critical scope changes to a few projects. So we're asking the MPO to, before considering new projects, fully fund cost changes to these 3 projects. First is a bus priority investment on Tremont and Columbus Streets in the city of Boston that's going to extend the existing center running bus lanes up from Jackson Square toward Ruggles Station. And that project is looking for another $7.5 million. Second, the MPO has similarly in the past invested in Jackson Square Station, which is an elevator and accessibility upgrade. And that project will be looking for up to $7.25 million. That's kind of a cap maximal number. And finally, last year, I believe the MPO invested in a project to install a new interlocking and new turnback track at Reading on the Haverhill commuter rail line that would allow 30-minute service in the future. That is every 30 minutes on the Haverhill line as far as Reading. And that project is looking for another $6 million. Next slide, please. So we're going to dive into a little bit more detail on each new project in a moment, but we wanted to show the scenarios that we've constructed up front. These 2 scenarios try to express our highest priorities. You'll see that they include some of the same projects and diverge in a few places. We have tried to calibrate the requests in each of these scenarios to the vicinity of what we understand to be the available remaining funding in federal fiscal years 25 to 26 after accounting for cost increases on other projects, including our own. Although, as you heard from Ethan before, it seems like there's still a little bit of wrangling going on over exactly what that number is going to be. In terms of thinking about these scenarios, think about them as proposals. These projects are all priorities for the MBTA, and in many cases for our partner municipalities. And the MPO may, of course, choose its own slate of projects to fund. But as you'll see, I hope each puzzle piece here is a unique size. And to be perfectly honest, there are only so many different iterations of the ways the variously sized puzzle pieces can fit together. So for scenario 1 here, we are looking at a request to fund a bus circulation project reconfiguring Nubian Square Station in Roxbury, which, as many of you know, is a big bus transfer station at $5 million. We're requesting $2.5 million to modernize park and pedal locations. That's like a park and ride, but for bicycles and other micromobility devices across the system. And that's at 12 to 13 different locations across 9 different municipalities and multiple modes. And that project at its maximal cost would be $2.5 million. It is scalable. We are looking in this scenario for funding at $14 million for a very similar project to the Reading turnback track, but this one on the Fitchburg line at Kendall Green Station in Weston, which would allow 30-minute headways on the inner Fitchburg line as envisioned in the Rail Vision report as far out as Brandeis and inner Weston. And then finally, we have a very high priority elevator project at Central Station on the Red Line in Cambridge, which is a project that's already underway but has a funding gap. And we are looking for $5 million in this scenario from the MPO for that project out of a total project need of $10 million. We're also seeking additional funding for that project elsewhere. All right, that is that scenario. And let's go to the next slide, please. All right. In scenario 2, we are elevating to the top of this list a project in Mattapan Square, that is on Mattapan on the border of Milton in Boston, which would reconfigure Mattapan Square. to give transit priority down with a center running bus lane and reconfigure some intersections, as well as making various streetscape and other transit priority improvements. And I believe the city of Boston has more details to share on that. That request would be at $20 million, and I'll share more details in a moment. Again, our very high priority elevator project at Central is here at $5 million, and the pedal and park modernization, which you will see here, is reduced to $1.5 million to fit into what we understand to be the available funding. That would involve reducing it from 2.5 to 1.5, would still reach all of the stations, but would involve not modernizing the control systems to be compatible with our future fare system. You'll notice then in the top scenario here, the Nubian Square project is not included. However, it is a very high priority for us, very near-term impact. The design will be ready by the time these funds can be obligated, and construction would be very short. So we are proposing that the MPO consider funding that in a future year of the transit transformation set aside in this scenario too. All right, next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about each of the bus priority projects. Next slide, please. Tremont Columbus here, as I mentioned, this is an already programmed project in the TIP. We are very grateful for the existing MPO funding. We are asking, again, because of cost increases and scope changes, for a little bit more funding to kind of get this across the finish line. We have a very nice picture here of the existing busway on the southern part of Columbus Ave, and we want to kind of extend this model up to Ruggles. We are pretty confident in the cost estimate, and we think this funding will really help get the project across the finish line. Next slide, please. All right. For Nubian Station, for those of you who have been there, you know that that's kind of a long-standing bus transfer point. But if you have heard at the recent MBTA board meeting, there have been some customer requests for better wayfinding and more accessibility there. It's kind of a high-profile item. And this project would put $5 million toward constructing accessible passenger platforms, helping to change the way buses move in and out of the terminal. And it also really aligns nicely with some investments that the city of Boston is making in the streetscape and in the organization of that neighborhood, as well as in future investments in center running bus lanes and other bus priority measures for the routes that are running through Nubian, which is a huge percentage of bus ridership for the MBTA and in the city of Boston. As I mentioned, this is something that can be done very, very quickly. The design will be ready to go by the time the funds are obligated. Next slide, please. All right, and thank you to the city of Boston for providing the picture on the slide here. Mattapan Square, again, the southern end of the larger Blue Hill Avenue corridor, which you have probably heard about. This is a new project we are bringing to the MPO. Would reconfigure Mattapan Square to update the bus routing. Currently, buses have to make a little U-turn, and by little I mean not so little. It adds 4 to 6 minutes to travel times, as well as taking the buses over the Neponset River and actually into Milton before they can enter Mattapan Station, which is an important transfer point to the Ashmont-Mattapan high-speed line, and would also improve safety for all users of this very complex and busy area. The funding request here is $20 million. We're not exactly sure what the final project cost will be. It might be a little bit higher than that, but the city of Boston and the MBTA are working hard together to lower the costs for that project and to agree on the scope. We're pretty confident that this would be a very solid chunk of funding for the project to advance it through full design and into construction. Next slide, please. All right, so let's talk about the rail modernization projects a little bit. Next slide. All right. The Reading turn track, as I mentioned before, this delivers turn track and signal improvements that will allow the MBTA to provide service every 30 minutes on the Haverhill line as far as Reading, running through Malden and Melrose into Reading and Wakefield into Reading. We thank the MPO for its prior commitment to this project, and we're requesting an additional $6 million to cover a cost increase we have experienced and take the project to completion. Next slide, please. Very similar project on the Fitchburg line. We're bringing you now here for the first time. This would deliver some infrastructure improvements, again, allowing service every 30 minutes on the inner part of the Fitchburg line as far as Kendall Green and Weston. This would affect Boston, Cambridge, Belmont, Waltham, and Weston, and it's $14 million. Next slide, please. All right, now I'm going to talk a little bit about accessibility and station access projects. Next slide, please. Jackson Square. This is a project that, again, we're grateful to the MPO for already committing funding toward. The project identified some scope changes with some critical structural deficiencies that were identified with the station itself. So it needs a small amount more funding here, $7.25 million as the maximum. It might come in a little below that to get the project across the finish line here. And this project would be adding a new elevator, which would be a second elevator there at the station in case the other one goes out of business, as well as the modernization of the existing elevator, something we're really trying to do across the entire system. Next slide, please. All right, Central Station in Cambridge. This project would construct 2 new elevators at Central again, so that we have extra ones in case one is out of operation, as well as modernization of the existing outbound elevator, which was one of the most unreliable elevators across the entire system. This is a larger project. We're coming to the MPO to request partial funding in the amount of $5 million. We would, of course, be grateful for more because there is still a remaining projected budget gap in there, but this is how it fits with the other projects that are also priorities. Next slide, please. All right, and so as I mentioned, the Park and Pedal modernization project, I believe my colleague Pete Roby is still here in case folks have questions about this one. This would update about 15 Park and Pedal facilities system-wide. It would do a number of things, such as kind of modernizing obsolete infrastructure and allowing for parking of a wider variety of bikes and micromobility devices, as we're seeing kind of an explosion in the types of devices that folks are using. Would make them more accessible. Currently, the current facilities involve sometimes lifting a heavy bike up, which not everyone can do, as well as improving wayfinding. And we really think this is a great project for regional appeal, as it does reach much of the rapid transit network, several commuter rail stations, and also potentially Nubian Square. And this is a nice project in that it's a pretty small funding request. It's also scalable based on what funding ends up being available, and the request here would be sufficient to take the project through design and construction. So I'll just close with a recap of the 2 scenarios and then hand it back to Ethan for a discussion. Again, scenario 1, we have Nubian bus circulation, pedal and park modernization, the inner Fitchburg line, 30-minute headways, and accessibility at Central Station. And then scenario 2, next slide, please, includes Mattapan, Central Station accessibility, pedal and park modernization, and a future request to the MPO through the Transit Transformation Program for the Nubian projects. All right, again, thank you for your time. We greatly appreciate your consideration and the opportunity to bring these projects to the MPO, and we are happy to answer any questions.
Right. Do any members of the committee have questions? Brad.
Thank you, Jen. And thank you, Sandy. Really appreciate the briefing, and Ethan, great work as always. I definitely want to underscore something that both Jen and Ethan mentioned, which is that MPO board members have consistently requested our partners at the MBTA bring us a slate of projects as early as possible in the TIP process. So I really appreciate the fact that there is a menu here. I will note that it's relatively late in this process, and this is a process improvement that we all need to remain committed to, folks. We need to have projects delivered to us in a more timely manner to allow for scoring. So that leads me to an important question, Jen and Sandy. We see uses here on these project profiles, but we do not see key information about readiness. So Sandy, I wonder, can you give us a quick answer about whether any of these new projects in particular are at critical design milestones? How real are they? How can this MPO evaluate them on a level playing field? given the urgency and the magnitude of the funding and cash flow challenges we are facing with this tip cycle. I'll probably have another question in a minute, Jen, but why don't I yield the floor? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. I think we don't have everybody on the call today. We need to deliver that information. We can certainly deliver it next week, or in between. If Pete, if you're still here, maybe you can talk to the status of the Pedal and Park project. I think Alex Hallowell had to leave, and she was going to speak to Nubian and to Mattapan, but I believe the city of Boston has Charlotte Fleetwood here to talk about Mattapan.
Yeah, I can talk about the Pedal and Park modernization. So there are, I see it as two components, as Sandy mentioned. It's one is sort of upgrading infrastructure or bike racks and wayfinding. The other is upgrading the access control system, which are sort of two separate implementation streams. The first, we've done sort of an existing conditions analysis or assessment as to need and started developing some sort of conceptual plans. As you might imagine, given that we're talking about bike racks that are essentially bolt in place within the pedal and parks. It's very light construction and very minimal sort of documentation required to get to a constructible product. So the timeline for document production would be very short and nimble for that phase. The access control phase we're in a planning stage, identifying vendors who can provide solutions that will integrate with our new AFC 2.0 fare system. So we just had an RFI close last week on this matter, and we're looking forward to moving forward with a procurement to get a vendor in place who would then retrofit all of our stations with the technology.
If I can jump in here again before we go to Charlotte, one point to make first is that we have vetted these for readiness internally. We can get it all written down in one place and deliver it to members. The other point to make is that because this is funding that will be flexed to FTA, it can be obligated in 2025 and 2026 and does not have to be spent right away. And we understand the MPO's priority to see the projects to completion in the near term, and I think we've presented projects that can be delivered in the near term, but there's no obligation to. One of the nice things about bringing FTA flex projects is that they don't have to be spent. The money doesn't have to be spent immediately.
Right. Should we pass it over to Charlotte to speak to Mattapan Square?
Sure. So the Mattapan Square project, we've been studying this intersection for quite some time. We had a very extensive community engagement process, and we have a design that we feel pretty good about for the intersection. And, taking it up to Babson Street, we want to do a little bit more engagement about whether to have angle parking or parallel parking, but it's been surveyed, it's been estimated, all the traffic analysis is done, and we have CAD plans for the design. So I feel like we can wrap it up, and get it done within the next 2 years, the design.
Thanks, Charlotte. Any further questions or comments on that subject before I pass it over to, and Derek, so do you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, sorry, Lynn. I had a question about Mattapan just while we're on the topic. I was curious if that is the 16 million, or I guess $20 million amount for Mattapan Square. I see it's transit priority, but it sounds like it's a decent amount of roadway work as well. I was just wondering if you could distinguish like what amount of that is for kind of, I guess, in that flex to FTA category and the transit side, and then what amount is for the roadway work, and if it would be kind of locally funded, some of it, and then MPO funded for a portion. I'm just curious about that breakdown if possible.
It's a little hard to break it down, but there's a 4-minute bus travel savings by going directly into the station versus doing the Mattapan loop, and that's a substantial time savings for each of the buses that goes into that station. So there's also right now the crossings to get to the station are not accessible, and a person would have to cross 6 different intersections to get to the station, just from one side of the road to the other. So we would make it safer for pedestrians, accessible, and have major bus travel time savings for this project.
Great, thank you.
Great. Any other questions on Mattapan? Otherwise, we'll pass it over to Len.
Thank you, Jen. So, what was the other commuter rail project? There's.
If we could go back to scenario 1.
Yeah. So it's Fitchburg, and what was the other one? I thought there were 2.
Yeah, so the other one was Reading, which is an existing project.
And how much is it?
I believe Reading is currently programmed about 14 million, and we're asking for another 6.
Okay, gotcha. Because I would like to see one of the commuter rail projects. That we pick up one of those, because they changed the headways to 30 minutes, which is great. That I think makes those lines more accessible to something that people think about. The Nubian Square one, that's fairly inexpensive. If you have the money, in the transit transformation program, I think it'd be good there, because I would like to see us really change that station, into something, that makes people go wow, that they really feel differently about that whole area. So that's just my comments. My question, so since these are coming from your capital program, I'm sorry, Sandy, do you have scores for them, MBTA scores for them?
I don't believe we do. Currently, my colleague Ryan Josty, who's running our CIP process, was not able to be here today. Also, I think not all of these were totally formally submitted to our CIP process. But there's going to be a lot. I will just say this: there's going to be a lot in our CIP process this year that scores really well and isn't getting funded because there's just not enough money. And that, I think these are good examples of that.
Yeah. Well, it would help us with the kind of picking amongst them according to our own criteria, kind of getting at what Brad mentioned. But to Brad's point, I just don't know if we can make this process start any faster, given when we become aware of the monies that we have available. It seems to me that we went about as early as we could, but maybe Ethan could speak to that. That's it. Thank you, Jen. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Len. Over to Brad.
Thank you, Jen. Sandy, do you mind if I just query a tiny bit deeper on those commuter rail questions? So Len, thank you for bringing them up, anticipating one of my questions. Something that Somerville has articulated as inner core rep on the board, really consistently, is our efforts to prioritize investments that serve multiple sub-regions. That's part of the reason that we're so passionate about commuter rail and about the electrification and about the transition to high-frequency headway regional rail, which has been endorsed by the MBTA board. We know this, and it's made us really, really excited with the Reading Turn Track project that was recommended and endorsed last year. So obviously, I'm delighted to see the Fitchburg Turn Track articulated here. And so, Sandy, a question that I'd like to understand is the scope very similar, meaning that it's limited to turn track production out near that Kendall Green station? Are there other elements of power and propulsion, right of way, that we should be understanding? How real is this project is really what I'm getting at. And if it is real, I believe that is something that the MPO should give serious consideration to, in part because commuter rail is one of those really, really critical kind of coalition building modes of travel that links our exurban, suburban, and urban inner core communities together. We are all depending on giving people more legitimate travel when they're trying to get 20 or 30 miles across the system. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. So I will say, first of all, that we can get our technical experts on this project, Brad Woodford and Alistair Sowers, in the room to answer some questions. I'm not the technical expert, I'm the delivery boy. This project is just about that turn track. It is limited in scope, but it's not saying anything about future modes or future propulsion. It is linked to one thing in part, which is an idea that I believe has been popping up for 20 or 25 years to build a multimodal center in the triangle kind of defined by Route 128, Route 20 and the Fitchburg line, as well as the Mass Central Rail Trail. And maybe Derek Cravatt can speak to the progress of that project since it was in the 128 corridor plan. The projects are not mutually dependent. One is still helpful without the other. And I believe it will help deliver 30-minute headways without any other changes to anything. But it is kind of tied up in the whole concept for that general geographic area.
Great. Sandy, were you asking if Derek had anything to add to that, or?
Yeah, sorry, I was wondering, Derek, I knew that you worked on that plan, and I don't know where that project stands. I know there's a lot of private-public elements to it, so.
Yeah, I will follow up. I believe you're referring to the Route 128 Land Use and Transportation Study, which was through the Office of Transportation Planning. I was not directly involved in it, but I know who to ask about that. So I'll follow up on that, Sandy and Brad, and I can get an answer on that.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Thank you.
Fantastic. Any other, I guess, questions for Sandy? I will note that it sounds like it sounds like we'll have the TAT back again to answer some follow-up questions, and that there was an additional some additional content that Ethan wishes to share. I know we are getting quite close to time, so I will note that this meeting is being recorded, and so if anyone does have to leave, that you'll have access to the content afterwards. So I guess if I don't see any hands in the next few seconds, I will turn it back to Ethan.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. And if we could just jump 2 slides, I think. So as Jen just mentioned, I do have a lot of content to go through here. So if folks can't stick around, there is no problem there. This will be recorded. And as I mentioned in the chat, this is one of 4 meetings that we'll be having on tip scenarios, with the next meeting being our meeting of the MPO board on March 28th at 10 a.m. and then March 21st at 10 a.m. And then the next tip committee meeting being March 28th at 1 p.m. and then another MPO board meeting at 10 a.m. on April 4th. So there are plenty more opportunities, and today will not result in any votes or actions being taken. This is just a strategy discussion. John, I don't know if you have something as well.
Yeah, my only question, the only point I wanted to raise, Ethan, is that Highway had a couple projects that we were going to present today, and it doesn't seem like you received anything. And I was on mute I couldn't unmute myself for a bit, but I had like one slide just to talk about 3 highway projects for at least discussion. And I didn't want to have everyone disappear before we had that opportunity.
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure. I guess Ethan and Srileka, is it feasible to have John share his slides, or I'll leave it to you both?
We weren't aware of this. I didn't receive any emails about this or any phone calls about this. In fairness, given the limited time that I know folks have, if we do want to present that now, I think we can do so. Because again, there's no action being taken today, so we'll make use of the time we have. We don't have any slides though, so I don't know if we can do.
I don't know if I can share to the screen, Ethan. I just have one slide here to just go over, but
see if we can get you control on that.
Yep.
John, can you try sharing your screen?
Can you guys see that slide?
Yes, you're not on present mode, just so you know.
Yeah, I'm just gonna. I wanted to make sure we could share first. Yeah. How's that? That coming through? Okay. So the only 3 projects that are related to traffic and safety and in shared use path. We have an intersection in Medford, which is our project 611974, which is Main Street, South Street, Main Street, Mystic Valley Parkway, and Main Street at Mystic Ave, that we would be able to deliver in 2026. It is on the statewide program at this time at about just under $8.5 million. It is one of our top 200 intersections, so it is a priority for safety improvements. Second project is the Arlington Stratton School Improvement Safe Routes to School project, which is available for delivering in 2025. It's a fully accessible walking path route with safe roadway crossings to the Stratton Elementary School in the town of Arlington. And that's our project number 609531, apologies, at $1.625 million. And then the third one is the shared use path in Medford, which is the Medford shared use path connection at Route 28 and Wellington underpass, which is at about $4.385 million. Project that could be delivered in fiscal 2025. The scope of the project is to construct a multi-use boardwalk under the crossing of the Mystic River by State Route 28. Bridge is owned by MassDOT, and the boardwalk will connect the land owned by MassDOT and DCR. The project would close the gap in the area's multimodal network by connecting to shared use paths on either side of the project. I will make sure you get this, Ethan. I'm not sure why it didn't go through for us, but I'll get you this one slide with the projects, and we can be prepared to discuss it more at the next meeting, Jen. I don't want to take away from Ethan's additional content, but I will take any questions if there are any.
Great, thank you. Rich, did you have your hand up for a question?
Yeah, just a real quick question. This is to Ethan. Ethan, there were other projects that were shown on the document that was included that has the 25 to 29 preliminary scenario that were in red, that essentially they're getting moved and that sort of thing. I didn't want to take all the time and going through each one of those today, but I can send you that information if that's helpful relative to project status and certain other elements of the project. Would that be helpful to send those along to you?
I would appreciate any information that any of the stakeholders for any of these projects can provide, as while we do have information available for each right now, the better level of detail that we can synthesize for these summaries, the better. So
yeah,
any information we can give.
All right, yeah, I have a couple for Lynn, Wakefield, and Brookline, so I can send those off to you. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Over to Eric.
Yeah, thank you, Rich. And particularly if any of those projects are the ones that have gone up by more than 10% cost, I think we're very interested to know, what that is. I think the presentation we received from the folks from Hingham was very good about what those costs were associated with. Question for John Bouchard. John, these projects here, are these already on the tip in the highway?
They're on the state side, Eric.
On the state
yes,
side.
They're already on the tip under the state side. Yes, these would be potential scenario projects to replace.
And so if we were to move these over to the MPO side, tip target side, what, like, that frees up money for other things that you guys would do? Is that the gist of it?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to get this list of projects that we felt met the goals of the Boston MPO, and we do have projects that we're looking at that would replace some of these projects in the appropriate colors. MassDOT, we have to worry about the color of money, different funding sources, different timelines, et cetera, where the MPO is able to fund just I don't want to say a lump sum, but there's a little bit more complexity on the categories on the DOT side. So we would need to replace the HSIP and the safe routes to school and the shared use path with appropriate funding under those three type of projects, where the MPO would just be able to allocate Boston MPO money to those.
I mean, as this process advances, I think if you could also share with us kind of, what those freed up resources, like what that would go to and how that would be, help advance a project.
Absolutely.
That would be great to know just what this would do in terms of influencing kind of the overall, tip.
I will do that, Eric. And as I said, because I know we have several meetings on this topic, I wanted to get the information out as a preliminary because I think that the discussion point is key, and then I will come back with one of our future meetings, whether it's the full board, full MPO next week, or this committee 2 weeks out with some additional information on what would free up and what we would put in those categories.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Great. Well, thank you. And I'm not seeing any other hands. So at this point, I think I'll pass it back to Ethan. Again, he has some additional information to share that's, I think, important for us to understand before we kind of continue on in the next several meetings where we'll be kind of sorting through the scenarios. At the same time, we're not going to be discussing or making decisions. So if you do need to pop off now, you can access this information afterwards via, I think, the slide deck and the recording.
Yeah, of course. And thank you for that. So to move into the next stage of this presentation, which is unfortunately not a brief one, but it does have ample information to share here today. This is the initial TIP scenario strategy for federal fiscal years 25 to 29. If we can go on to the next slide. As part of today's discussion, I created a draft initial scenario for the federal fiscal years 2025 to 29 TIP for your consideration to help illustrate some of the new information that has come to light following the TIP Readiness Days update, in addition to how funding of some new projects impacts fiscal constraint across multiple years, including some of those projects I mentioned earlier during the preface stage of the MBTA's presentation. This initial scenario already accounts for all cost increases, including those MBTA cost increases, and factors in regional transit authority projects that I hope to get to in this presentation as well. And as I believe I mentioned briefly during my scoring update on March 7th to the MPO board. So first off, if we go on to the next slide. Earlier in the meeting, somebody mentioned that there is scenarios, plural, usually. The reason why there is only one TIP scenario at this time is due to the issue of fiscal constraint, or rather the amount of deficit that we have in federal fiscal year 2027. Right now, there are two major issues facing the development of the TIP that kind of stall progress on other fronts. The first being identifying strategies for choosing what can be done with federal fiscal year 2025 project design pilot projects. Then how to attain fiscal constraint in federal fiscal year 2027, and then what the strategy should be to balance the new projects in federal fiscal year 2029 with contingency funding in that year and with our advanced construction obligations in that year. Given the complexity of federal fiscal years 25 and 27, it did not make sense at this very early stage in scenario development to have multiple scenarios, as it just may lend itself to confusion. Rather, we're hoping to compartmentalize those two major items, discuss those first, and then once those needs have been addressed, we've attained constraint, try to work out other ways to improve the program. Again, there will be no voting action taken here today. This is just a forum for discussion and conveying information to inform the first discussion that will happen next week. So, quick update, if we go on to the next slide. When we did the readiness presentation and scenario back on February 15th, we identified that there was a surplus in federal fiscal year 25 of $72.6 million. In 2026, there was a surplus of $34.7 million approximately, and a deficit of negative $80.7 million in that year. In fiscal 28, we had also identified a deficit of negative $26 million, and in fiscal 29, after accounting for advanced construction on major high priority and regional projects, we had about $51.2 million for all new projects there. So since then, we've been taking some actions that we hope this initial scenario can help to address. If we go on to the next slide, first off, these numbers reflect those new cost elements and changes that were mentioned earlier. GM and then, GM2 and then Hingham had mentioned that there was actually a cost decrease versus what was presented for their project on Route 3A. That is factored into the fiscal 26 number already. Furthermore, that Wilmington project I mentioned earlier that saw that cost increase is also factored in already for federal fiscal year 25. What remains after addressing all cost increases and doing some changes, which I will get to, we now have about $20.6 million available for new projects in fiscal 25, 11.77 million in fiscal 26, minus a few million though for another item I'll mention. We are still looking in federal fiscal year 27 at a deficit of 23.23, which we are looking for guidance on addressing. And we have barely achieved constraint in federal fiscal year 2028 at $220,000 by moving some money around between fiscal 28 into fiscal 29 and moving some projects funding out of 27 into 28 if those projects were at risk for a delay already. We have also been able to program the new projects in federal fiscal year 29, those 3 new construction projects in that year. And I should also mention, as I will get to, there is a 4th new project in Quincy programmed in federal fiscal year 2026. It is a smaller scale project, however. So let's break this out and go by changes through year, because again, this is just a baseline to start off, and we're hone this as we go. So in federal fiscal year 2025, again, we've accounted for all project highway project cost increases, including that Wilmington Route 38 increase. We have also already accounted for cost increases, assuming that this will be voted on as a yes, for Jackson Square with an additional $7.25 million, bringing the total MPO contribution to $21.25 million. I'm sorry, excuse me, an additional $7.25 million on top of $21.25 million in that year. Reading Station, this is actually a little bit out of date. That is an additional $6 million. We have already factored into the scenario, not $2 million. And then we have already factored in $7.5 million in federal fiscal year 25 for the Columbus Ave Phase 2 project. It is worth mentioning that in this case, Columbus Ave Phase 2 has been funded across 2 other federal fiscal years. First for $14.8 million in federal fiscal year 2021 in that tip cycle, and then for an additional amount of funding in federal fiscal year 2024. This 7.5 is additive on top of that for a total contribution on that project to approximately, and let me get the exact number because as I mentioned, this item has been changing in recent times. Apologies, I should have this ready. To about $35 million of total contributions to date, with $20 million approximately programmed between federal fiscal years 24 and 25. The total contribution for Jackson Square would now be sitting at 33.5, and for the commuter rail projects, before accounting for anything new, $20 million, between $14 million of existing obligation and 6 there. In recognition of this contribution to existing MBTA projects, we have also preemptively programmed $8.3 million of regional transit authority projects between federal fiscal years 2025 and 2026. These are for both of the regional transit authorities in the Boston region, namely the Cape Ann Transportation Authority for $3.07 million, which includes $1.29 million to modernize their operating facility, $1.71 million of contribution for low emission buses in fiscal 25, and $65,000 for fare system upgrades for their Americans with Disabilities Act and Dial-A-Ride customers. The Metro West Regional Transit Authority similarly has been programmed for $3.73 million for a combination of procurement of low-emission bus vehicles for about $2 million, and also $1.75 million in fiscal 25 for a facility redesign to improve accommodations, not only for customers waiting at their Blandon hub, but also the ability for them to utilize these new buses in their vehicle bays and train personnel and run operations throughout the Blandon hub. We are also tentatively looking at funding about $10 million of project design. The total request that we received when this was initially drafted was $19.3 million. As was mentioned previously, some of those projects have had cost changes, some receiving awards, some requesting more funding now with revised estimates. So if we can go on to the next slide, we do have a couple more changes I'd just like to flag in 2025. So again, we are funding all community connections projects as part of this scenario at $1.24 million overall for projects on bicycle racks in Arlington, Boston, and Scituate, an on-demand microtransit pilot funded across 3 years for Chelsea and Revere, with each subsequent year of operation subject to reapproval by the MPO board based on ridership performance. Our first bicycle lanes project at the MPO in the city of Malden on Canal Street, and Revere as well, once again, for a Northern Blue Bikes extension project, such that Blue Bikes may be expanded to meet the Northern Strand and Griswold Park fields within the city of Revere. We're also looking to fund all 4 of the inaugural year of the Bike Share Support Program projects for $1.45 million, which will address 36 Blue Bike stations and 127 bikes in need of replacement in the communities of Boston, Brookline, Cambridge, and Somerville. With all of this in mind, we are currently looking at a surplus of about $20.6 million. The strategy for which that staff are recommending is that this be utilized for a combination of both contingency funding and for new MBTA projects. There's a similar case as we move on to the next slide in federal fiscal year 26, though with a little bit less funding available. So first off, this is the year where we started to make some changes to how balances of funding were adjusted among projects. For Norwood's intersection improvements at Route 1 and University Avenue project, this project was funded between 2 years of the TIP originally, with 11.1 million in fiscal 26 and 17.57 in fiscal 27. We have now consolidated that funding to be fully funded in federal fiscal year 26 for a total amount of 27.6 million. That was one of the ways we've tried to address the fiscal 27 deficit. Similarly, thanks to some correspondence between the city of Lynn, its consultants, MPO staff, and some folks at MassDOT, we had initially identified the Essex Street project in Lynn as a recommended delay out of federal fiscal year 25 to 27. However, based on discussions with the city of Lynn and some recent adaptations they've made in their project and public engagement strategies, the city believes that a federal fiscal year 26 start date for advertising is attainable. In recognition of that, the funding for this project, which is $19.7 million in total, is now being split with $10 million to start in fiscal 26 and $9.7 million in fiscal 27. That being that while we don't want to have the entire project be delayed to fiscal 27, we do still want to leave some money in that year just in case the project runs into any unexpected issues as we develop the next TIP following this one. As mentioned earlier, there is one new project in federal fiscal year 26, in addition to those others I mentioned from the RTAs, that being $1.89 million for intersection signalization at the Willard Street and Rich Udy Drive off-ramp for Interstate 93. That also includes a small shared use path to be constructed for a connection to bike lanes that will be implemented on Rich Udy Drive by the city of Quincy for connectivity to multifamily housing developments and Quincy Quarries, which is part of the Blue Hills. Lastly, for the Transit Transformation Program, there's an additional $750,000 each for the Cape Ann Transportation Authority and the Metro West Regional Transit Authorities for a low-emission bus project and their facility redesign for MWRTA, respectively. We've also reduced the transit transformation set-aside in federal fiscal year 2026 to reflect that, as this is a very large volume of funding for the RTAs and their capital plans for that year. There is still funding remaining of about $5 million in that program for the next cycle, and as we move to develop the federal fiscal years 26-30 TIP, we may revise that funding amount accordingly. So on to the next slide, because there is another item in here we want to evaluate. So in the development, I should note, I mentioned earlier that there is an $11.76 million surplus. We are currently tentatively treating that as a $8.76 million surplus, as we may be using this for a combination of both contingency and new projects, not only transit projects, but possibly a second phase of the project design pilot. Now, I mentioned earlier and in previous MPO meetings that we have had a lot of demand for active federal aid and MPO participation to enable municipalities to design their projects. That said, there's still a matter not only of fiscal constraint to fund design projects, but also capacity to do so. And as we work through the pilot program for federal fiscal year 25, it may not be prudent to have a full-blown, for lack of a better phrase, design pilot program in fiscal 26. With that said, there are 2 projects on the MPO's long-range transportation plan that do not currently have design funding. And as we move into the next few TIP cycles over the next few years, we are going to be entering the time band of the long-range plan with which those projects would be expected to start. In order to ensure that future long-range priority projects of the MPO have sufficient funding to get underway and dust off some of their old preliminary designs and maintain their momentum for project readiness, we are looking to program $3.05 million for long-range priority project design in federal fiscal year 26. Again, this is a proactive programming of this funding. This funding would not become available until October 1st, 2025, after the next tip is in effect, but we are setting this aside now in order to start planning around this very important activity. The two projects that would be subject here would be Lexington's Route 4 225 interchange and Hartwell Avenue project, which would be for about $1.6 million of funding, and Framingham's Route 126 and 135 grade crossing elimination project, among other additional projects in the city of Framingham, for about $1.4 million. That $1.4 million figure reflecting an amount of funding requested to design the project as part of the Federal Reconnecting Communities program, for which a grant was not awarded with this most recent cycle. So with that, we can then move into federal fiscal year 2027. And unfortunately, this is the most difficult year to work through. In order to address the deficit in federal fiscal year 2027, we have made a few recommendations to rebalances of funding and adjustments on project start years. In consultation with the city of Boston and also between the city of Boston and its neighboring communities, we are removing $8.6 million of funding in federal fiscal year 27, effectively delaying the reconstruction of Rutherford Avenue project to federal fiscal year 28. This is according with an estimation on when the project will be ready by the city for project readiness and delivery there. For McGrath Boulevard, given that project is on track in order to be fully funded within the next tip cycle, we are recommending a small reduction in funding of the set aside of $35 million there by $5 million down to $30 million. Again, we anticipate that this project can stay on track and that this small reduction will not impact the project's ability to stay on track or not be fully funded in the federal fiscal years 26 to 30 tip. With project 613088, Malden Spot Pond Brook Greenway, this project is being delayed out of federal fiscal year 27 into federal fiscal year 28. At tip readiness days, the recommendation by MassDOT was to hold the year, but it was flagged as high risk. The reason why there was no delay recommended is because a schedule had not been set on the project, and the last correspondence was the scoping meeting that I believe had happened in December of 2022 at PRC approval. Given the project is not yet at 25% design and it was programmed in fiscal 27, we recommended that push 1 year into fiscal 28. The project's budget is about $4.8 million, and that small scale was what enabled it to make that push. If we move into federal fiscal year 20, the next slide, I should say, I'm sorry. For project 613121, we do actually have an update on this versus what was originally on the slides. This was a small scale $5 million targeted multimodal and safety improvement project on Route 16. In the last tip cycle, we had introduced it into federal fiscal year 26 as a fill-in project for MassDOT in that year. What had happened is that the project at readiness days was recommended for a delay to fiscal 27, and we had considered deprogramming it as part of this program, and the scenario currently reflects that because it was a MassDOT fill-in project, assuming funding availability in that last tip. We have had recent discussions with MassDOT, and deprogramming this project in the regional target program is still would still allow MassDOT to keep it funded in their statewide highway program. However, there is a corresponding follow-on project in Route 16 that has also faced project readiness delays. The current estimate cost on that project is $17 million, which will no longer be reflected in the tip because of readiness and cost issues there. And just reiterating some changes from federal fiscal year 26. With the rebalance of funding for Lynn's Essex Street project, there is about $9.7 million still programmed here now, and there is no longer any funding programmed in federal fiscal year 27 for the Norwood Intersection Improvement Project at Route 1 because it is now fully funded in federal fiscal year 26. There is also some money here for the new on-demand microtransit project in Chelsea, though that money is taken out of the community connection set aside and does not impact the deficit in this federal fiscal year. With all of those actions in mind, we have been able to confine the deficit down from $80 million to $25.23 million. There are not any viable options remaining in order to consider how this deficit should be addressed, besides selecting one or more projects currently funded by the MPO in federal fiscal year 27 for deprogramming or a funding reduction in that year. We can go on to the next slide. I can go into a little bit more detail on what that means. I'm sorry, I actually have that later in the presentation. So just to move into 2028 before we get to that, Brookline's rehabilitation of Washington Street was recommended for a delay to federal fiscal year 28. That was done in order to address the deficit in that year. The funding is now being split instead of having approximately $30 million lump sum in 28 to be split with 10 in 28 and 19 million in 29. For Westwood's reconstruction of Canton Street project, instead of keeping all funds in federal fiscal year 28, the funding is now split to hold 13 million in 28 and 10 million in federal fiscal year 29. We are currently recommending a delay of the project. Oh, I'm sorry, that's a holdover from a previous slide. This project is at 25% design. That is incorrect. That said, the project was flagged as high risk during readiness days because there have been scope adjustments on this project recently. Malden Spot Pond Brook Greenway is now also programmed for $4.86 million in federal fiscal year 28 after that deprogramming in 2027. To help balance and break constraint in federal fiscal year 2028 and get into the black, the community connection set aside has been reduced to $2 million from $2.5 million. If funding were to become available in federal fiscal year 27, we may make further rebalances to refill this set aside and allocate additional money to federal fiscal year 28 to improve contingency in that year. So the outcome for federal fiscal year 2028 right now is that $26 million deficit in that year has been addressed. And as mentioned there, if we can find more money in federal fiscal year 27, we will rebalance some things to add in more breathing room in that year. Moving on to the next slide, please. So in 2029, this is a year in which we have all new projects or existing obligations to ongoing projects. The first thing that we do at the MPO when we are looking at a new year of the TIP is to evaluate advanced construction or AC projects. Advanced construction is a mechanism that all MPOs in the Commonwealth use to fund their projects across multiple years. Typically, within the Boston Region MPO, we have sufficient regional target funding to accommodate projects in full in one single year, with the exception of very large-scale projects. In this case, Boston's reconstruction of Rutherford Ave would have $45 million programmed in federal fiscal year 2029. This is above the recommendation that was previously had in the federal fiscal year 24 to 28 TIP of $33.5 million. The reason being is that there is still, even with this $45 million program in 29, $120 million that must be programmed in the next few TIP cycles. In the interest, as the design pilot gets underway and expecting that GANS payments, which I will get to on a future slide, will recommence back in 2032, we would like to obligate more funding to this project as soon as possible in order to alleviate inflationary pressures as we develop future TIP cycles. Next, in Somerville, there is the McGrath Boulevard construction project, for which we are recommending $30.31 million of programming. And we believe that while we did reduce the programming amount by $5 million in federal fiscal year 2027, there is only a small amount of money left to go based on the current cost estimate to get that project fully funded by the fiscal 26 to 30 TIP, which is the TIP after this one. For Lynn's rehabilitation of Western Avenue, we are recommending $20 million programmed, and it may be fully funded in the next TIP cycle as well, as with McGrath Highway. And as mentioned previously, for Westwood's Canton Street and Brookline's Washington Street projects, those projects are staying on track in federal fiscal year 28 right now, but we are spreading the funding around with 19 million going to Brookline in 29 and 10 million to Canton Street in 29. So to go on to the next slide, we do have some good news here, and that is with the new projects. We had sufficient funding to cover new projects within the TIP, given the situation in other years. 2 of these 3 projects are reapplications from last year's TIP cycle. The first being Bellingham's roadway rehabilitation of Route 126 Hartford Road, which has a total cost estimate of $16.7 million. However, due to fiscal constraint, this project is funded at 50% of its cost in federal fiscal year 29, and we anticipate ACing its cost into federal fiscal year 30 for the next TIP. Similarly, with Argilla Road in Ipswich, this is a somewhat unique project as the project is still moving towards a 25% design submission, and there are still some emerging Mass Department of Environmental Protection permitting needs that the town is coordinating on right now, but still need to be worked out for a revised cost estimate with MassDOT. The programming of $6.6 million in federal fiscal year 29 reflects the current cost estimate with inflation factored in. Any cost increases on this project over the next year would likely be addressed in federal fiscal year 30 through advanced construction. And last but not least, we have Sudbury's Bruce Freeman Phase 3 project for a bike path construction with $8.53 million of programming in federal fiscal year 2029. The project is about to be at 25% design in June, which means that there is also a possibility for acceleration up from federal fiscal year 2029 in the next few tip cycles. However, we do not have funding capacity in federal fiscal year 27 or 8 to accommodate that at this time. So again, to reiterate, if we go on the next slide, all of these actions culminate in a recommendation of about 20.6 million, 25, 11.77 and 26, 25.23 and 27, very close to constraint in federal fiscal year 28, and $2.26 million in 2029. Again, there's still a deficit in federal fiscal year 27, which means we are not in constraint. And we have two options on the next slide. The two options to address this $25.23 million deficit are to either rebalance advanced construction funding on projects or to deprogram projects. Advanced construction is the easiest lever to pull. However, there are few options remaining here. With the delays of the Western Avenue project in Lynn and also the removal of funding on Rutherford Ave already, there is only one project remaining in federal fiscal year 27, and that is McGrath Highway in Somerville. While that $30 million of funding could be shifted off, it would very likely adversely impact the project's readiness to deliver. In addition, there are also federal discretionary grant funding opportunities that are actively being pursued by the project that may be hampered if the project were to be delayed in this tip cycle, as far as obtaining that funding, which would in turn create fiscal opportunities in the next tip cycle. And again, taking $30 million off this project today may not only impact its readiness and its discretionary grant candidacy, but it would increase the amount of cost and debt that needs to be taken on in future tip cycles, constraining the opportunity to bring back any projects. Option 2, which is the last resort, would be deprogramming projects. Deprogramming a project entails temporary removal of that project from the tip. It is not a total disqualification of any project, and any project that is selected for deprogramming could reapply to return if that project is making design progress there. Moreover, if that project were to reapply and has demonstrated design progress, it would likely be shortlisted for reprogramming. There will likely be 2 projects if this option is pursued among 8 different options that have been identified by staff for deprogramming. These options are listed starting on the next slide in alphabetical order. If we could go on to the next slide, please. So our options for deprogramming are as follows. These are all projects that are listed in federal fiscal year 27, whose budgets or project readiness have led to their identification as potentially being eligible for deprogramming. The first is Belmont's Community Path, which is the Belmont component of the Massachusetts Central Rail Trail. It was delayed 1 year into federal fiscal year 27, though it is at 25% design and is making design progress. The difficulty and the cause of the delay was right-of-way acquisition for the traversal of the MBTA's Fitchburg line. This is a $21.3 million project here, and there is a town meeting vote expected spring 2024. Public feedback on this project is mostly in support, though there is some opposition, mostly from abutters in the project area. Boston has a $16.63 million project, which is the Cambridge Street Bridge Preservation Project. This project was delayed from federal fiscal year 26 to 27 due to coordination issues with CSX Freight Rail. The city had a 100% design on hand when they applied for the project during the last tip cycle, and that design is still being modified through the project review committee process and design progress with MassDOT, with a 25% revision underway. The important thing to consider for this project is that because it is a city-owned bridge, despite being on the NHS, it does not necessarily raise to a level of highway district priority for repair. However, keeping this bridge in a state of good repair, which right now the condition is fair, is very critical to ensuring traffic control to keep both the Rutherford Ave and McGrath Highway projects on track. A delay of this project may cause a ripple effect on readiness for those other large-scale MPO-funded projects, in addition to other statewide highway projects that are also in the area as well. In Everett, there's also the reconstruction of Beecham Street project here. This project had pre-25% plans submitted in December 23, and as we heard earlier, they are making substantial design progress here. There's a 25% design expected in March. The 75 and 100% design submissions may also be consolidated for an expedited review process. The delay of this project by 2 years was for right-of-way issues at the railroad crossings, and given that this project is still making progress towards 25% and is likely to approach 75%, and given its cost of $10.95 million, this project may not be a good candidate for deprogramming at this time. Similarly, though in this case with a very small scale funding project, contrary to what the budget shows, Ipswich's resurfacing and related work project on Central and South Main Streets is also making design progress, but was delayed due to environmental and right-of-way issues. The delay would have a very small impact on the federal fiscal year 27 budget, as the project is actually a seed across 2 different years. While the total budget is $11.73 million, only 6 of that is in federal fiscal year 27, which means that it is unlikely that this project would actually make a significant impact if it were to be deprogrammed. If anything, it would likely then cause issues in federal fiscal year 28. The next slide, as was mentioned earlier, is the Salem Boston Street Improvements Project. This project is a revised budget of $26.12 million, but that cost estimate reflects a recent 75% design submission despite being in federal fiscal year 27. Generally speaking, 75% design is what would be expected for a project in fiscal 26. The main challenge on the project are the obtaining of easements. The city's been responsive on this project and is at that later design stage. However, given the cost of the project here, this is one of the larger scale and more impactful ones listed, though again, the project has made an advanced stage of design progress. As mentioned earlier, I've listed Somerville's McGrath Boulevard construction project for that $30 million in federal fiscal year 27, though again, it would likely very much adversely impact the readiness of the project if it were to be selected for deprogramming. The next project is Weston's reconstruction on Route 30 project. This project was delayed out of federal fiscal year 26 into 27 as it missed a 75% deliverable deadline in November 2023 due to contractual issues with their designer. The scope of the project has also been changed in an attempt to control cost after a 26% increase to remove several signals from the project scope and also make adjustments to the shared use path based on vocal opposition from abutters to the project, which would likely realign the situation for that project. There's also still a need for town meeting approval this coming spring, but with some effort, the town could make federal fiscal year 2026 if everything goes well here. And the last project here is Woburn's Roadway and Intersection Improvements Project at Woburn Common, Route 38. This project has a budget of $17.38 million, and it is not yet at 25% design. That 25% was due September of 2022. And the last activity on the project was a pre-25% checklist upload in October 2022. The cost estimate for this project is also several years old, as the project cost has not changed very substantially since the federal fiscal year's 21-25 tip. In that tip, it was approximately $16 million of estimate there. It was delayed from federal fiscal year 26 to 7 as intersection control evaluations and right-of-way progress processes have also yet to begin. And one of the important things to mention is that a revised cost estimate will be very important to ensuring that a decision could be made on what could potentially happen with this project. We also have one other matter that we're hoping to address as we get into next week's TIP development cycle. That being, on the next slide, the issue of the design funding amount in federal fiscal year 25. The MPO board, as developing the 2024-28 TIP, had set aside $4 million to fund a test sample of design projects. Given rising costs in the design, that $4 million has proven insufficient to get a representative sample, and funding surpluses in federal fiscal year 2025 have enabled us to accommodate more of those projects. However, with a revised estimate of design cost of $20.38 million in total requests, given one project has recently requested more funding and one is no longer in the running, we are currently recommending programming approximately $10 million of funding. There are some additional considerations here. One, we can go on the next slide, please. $10 million will not cover all design requests, and most of those applications listed will not be funded. Also, having a large number of applications funding may prove unwieldy. not only for management by municipal staff, but also by MassDOT staff who may be overseeing the contracts, and MPO staff to monitor the progress being made on these projects to ensure that design is progressing and that this is a sustainable long-term program. We do not want to overfund the program and have that come to the detriment of the stability of this in the long run as we look to improve the pipeline of projects. We have also not yet identified exactly what that sort of Goldilocks capacity is, in which we need to identify a number of projects which is sufficient for a representative sample, but not so great that we are overextending ourselves. Moreover, demand for MPO funding, as mentioned earlier when I was discussing Rutherford Ave and McGrath, is going to increase in future TIP cycles on our advanced construction projects. Those who were around for the development of the federal fiscal years 24-28 TIP may remember that the accelerated debt repayment on MassDOT's accelerated bridge program provided approximately $20 million of additional funding per year to the MPO to program new projects between federal fiscal years 27 and 29. That is a temporary reprieve of that debt service payment. The grant anticipation notes, or GANs, are the mechanism by which MassDOT funds a lot of their bridge preservation work, and the Next Generation Bridge Program, which is currently underway for funding bridge preservation, will have its debt service return in 2032. As the MPO is looking to fund these very expensive AC projects that are regional priorities and to make room for future long-range plan projects, we also want to be mindful that our amount of available funding may be reduced once we approach the 2028-32 TIP, at the same time that a lot of these design pilot projects are going to be looking for construction funding. So with all of that, I know that was a lot of information, and I appreciate folks staying here for quite some time. I would like to open the floor to discussion, and I'm happy to go back to any slide if folks have questions or want to provide comment on their projects for support.
Thank you so much, Ethan, and bravo for getting through all of that. I'd like to kind of focus this kind of what we go into two things. One, kind of additional points of information that people want to add about anything that Ethan has covered, and two, any like kind of questions about what was presented, just being mindful that we're over time. So I think the appropriate place for us to dive into kind of what should be done, and to some of the quandaries that Ethan has illuminated will be at later meetings of the MPO board and this committee. With that, I saw Jack's hand first. I think over to you.
Thank you, Chair Rowe and members of the committee. Jack Woodhouse, I'm the transportation planner with the city of Malden. I just wanted to express some concern with the the proposed reprogramming of the Malden Spot Pond Greenway project. I don't believe anybody reached out to the project sponsor to discuss reprogramming. As a project manager, I can attest that that hasn't happened. I think the rationale for reprogramming is inaccurate. Based on what Ethan said, our project design is on track, and there has been activity since 2022 that I think that maybe you're not aware of. So I'm happy to work with the MPO to have a discussion outside of this meeting regarding the actual status of our project. I just wanted to go on record of urging MPO staff to reach out to Malden and get the story on our Greenway project. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. I'm sure, unless Ethan has something to touch base with, I'm sure that we can have a conversation offline.
Yeah, we can do that and address that issue, especially in the context of the other design funding projects as well.
Fantastic. Next, I believe, was Rich. And Rich, you are on mute still.
There we go. A couple of comments, and then I have a quick question that maybe can be answered. So we already talked about Woburn, and again, hoping that doesn't get deprogrammed. I'm presuming the whole deprogramming process is it's not programmed on the current TIP element, but obviously given its importance, its score, it's advancing through the process, the city's investment in moving the project forward, that it would be reprogrammed. In terms of the Lynn Weston Ave project, that is the highest scoring project in the Boston MPO. And I saw that on one of the slides, and I kind of, Ethan, you were going through all those slides, and I was trying to keep track, and I may have lost track. I don't know if that project is being deprogrammed, but certainly there's a ton of regional significance with that one. It's Route 107, not just Weston Ave, but Route 107, heavy bus route, heavy transit route. And all of those things are being incorporated into that project. So moving it out a little bit is one thing. I don't think the city is opposed to that. But speaking on behalf of Mayor Nicholson, I would hope that that project would remain as a priority for the MPO. My question is, there are many projects that are now spread out over several federal fiscal years. Because presuming, and I guess my question is, does a project have to be programmed in a particular fiscal year, even though the funding for that project, the construction payments for that project as the project progresses, most of these projects will be 3 or 4 year durations. And so given that a project is a 3 or 4 year duration, can a project be spread out in more than 2 fiscal years, for example, particularly these projects that have a huge budget to them? Again, Weston Ave is, it's a $40 million project. Can that be spread out over several fiscal years as opposed to it just being sort of dropped, or even Woburn or Washington Street in Brookline, or any of these? And I guess that's the question. Do they have to be programmed, or can they be spread out over more than 1 or 2 federal fiscal years? Maybe
Yes, so I'm currently having Shrillake go back one more, I think. There we go. So this graphic on screen here actually shows the advanced construction schedule for Rutherford Avenue. And other projects like McGrath Highway and Western Avenue and Lynn look like this on the MPO's tip. It is very typical for other MPOs in the Commonwealth that have less regional target funding available to program all of their projects like this, if not their larger $15, $20 million ones. That is not typically the case in the Boston MPO, as we generally have sufficient funding available in a single federal fiscal year to address that. And furthermore, we also have funding where it is generally easier to manage the program as a whole, given the large volume of projects that we have, about 58 projects, to have it all be a lump sum for purposes of advertisement all at once. Advanced construction is really a tool that we utilize when we have fiscal constraint, an opportunity like this, but it is not to be taken lightly, especially given that we update the tip every single year.
So just to follow on to that, Ethan. So in other words, the money has to be obligated in order to let the contract and award the contract to the contractor. Is that right?
Yes, at the time of project advertisement as well. And the project is taken off the tip once that advertisement is made. At that point, MassDOT Highway administers it from there, and the funding is drawn down from what was obligated.
Got it. Thank you.
And I did see Tegan, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
No, I can wait. I can wait till after Sheila.
Okay. Sheila.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for letting me speak, because I know we're short on time, so I'll try to be quick. I just wanted to give a little context to our request. The Route 4-225 Bedford Hartwell reconstruction project is on the LRTP. We are working on our 25% design. And as part of that 25% design, our traffic analysis using the future projections from the build out showed that we needed to look at the whole interchange. Initially, we were just looking at the southbound ramps. But because of our needed traffic capacity, we wanted to look at the whole interchange. And MassDOT agreed and has graciously sponsored additional analysis money to look at all 4 ramps, or all 8 ramps, we might say, the whole cloverleaf. So we've been going through, and the best alternative so far to accommodate the traffic and get us the multimodality that we need, as well as making it safer, is a double diverging diamond. So the town has appropriated $1.75 million to move the project from 25% to 75%. So we're ready to start that. However, that money doesn't include
the design of the whole interchange. And so that's why we're coming back to ask for $1.6 million to include the whole interchange in that design. So I just wanted to give a little context. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll see you next week. And thank you, Ethan, for your detailed guidance and all this.
Thank you, Sheila. Tegan, do you want to jump in now, or have Eric speak first?
If your question is back to Sheila, you should go first. Thank you for asking.
Thank you. So if we start to design the interchange, I'm assuming that's a very big cost. Interchanges tend to be very expensive. Are we then, committing to the interchange in addition to this project? Do you have a sense of that, Sheila or Ethan?
So with regard to funding for projects in the long-range transportation plan, there would not necessarily be a commitment from a specific party to fund the project, especially given that the interchange is a MassDOT-owned asset, though the MPO would be involved in at least funding part of the design there. Given the scale of these projects for both Framingham and Lexington, it is also very likely there would need to be a federal discretionary grant component as well.
Okay, I mean, I think this meeting's great. It's lots of information here, and there's a ton of moving parts, going on. I just think with the design pilot, as we're calling it, I just think one of the things we have to be very conscious about is by committing, design funds, we are in some ways committing to the project that will then come from it. And I just think we have to be cognizant of that, and of what that means, and what that project is, is going to be, and what that commitment could be in the future in terms of, dollar amount. So no, I'm glad. This is great information and a lot to chew on. So thanks.
Thanks, Eric. Tegan.
Thanks. First, I'll just add on to what Eric said and then go back to what I was going to say is, Eric, yes, and this is a similar challenge we have when talking about projects that are in the long-range plan, is that it indicates a kind of commitment, but there are still many steps by which we can go through. So we do then score projects when they do come to the question around funding in the tip, right? And so there are still multiple stages after that stage that we can continue to reassess. But I do think that your point is important, that from each level, we want to be including projects that that do meet MPO goals and priorities so that they can get through the entire process, ideally. So I just kind of wanted to add that on as some further context. And then I just wanted to go back, just as the executive director of the MPO staff, I wanted to go back to Jack's earlier comment about the Malden project. Jack, I just wanted to make sure that, I just further acknowledge your comment or concern about, if there hasn't been full coordination. I really appreciate you staying on the meeting long enough to catch that and to react to us. I know that Ethan is a powerhouse of gathering information and communicating with folks, especially during this period between February 15th and today, when we get a lot of information, and we're still continuing to get information about, kind of project details and readiness and cost changes. And I know he does work extremely hard, and it is very much a part of our mission to ensure that we are coordinating as closely as possible with the municipalities who are proponents of and or affected by these projects. And so it is a priority that we are coordinating with you, Jack, as well as all of the others. And so I know Ethan will be following up, and I know we'll be sure we're being diligent with that, as well as he's been diligent with so much of the rest of the work that he's done. So I just wanted to kind of both acknowledge, Jack, that you call that out, and also just acknowledge the scale of coordination that is required and that Ethan does engage in this very, very complex process. So thank you, Jack, for your comment.
Thanks, Tegan. Are there any other kind of questions or points of information? Otherwise, we will wrap up this very long and very full meeting, I believe. I think we are at the end of the agenda. So I am, oh, we do have a time for members' items. Okay, so do any members have items that you would like to bring before we conclude? All right, seeing none, is there a motion to adjourn this meeting?
Motion to adjourn, Leonard.
Thank you, Len.
Eric, I'll second that.
Fantastic.
Yeah, great job. This was great. A lot of great information.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you.
All in favor?
To the chair. Yep, and the staff.
Aye.
Aye.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
So long. See ya.
Thank you,
See you next
everyone.
time.
Thank you.